understand you have 3 guests waiting in the wings, so I'll hand you over to introduce your panellists. And I'll keep an eye on the questions and answers as they're coming in and catch up with you in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. I think if we'd been holding this a week ago, it would have been a fireside chat, but fortunately the weather conditions are a lot better today. But nevertheless, I'm delighted to welcome my 3 guests who will hopefully now join us on screen. First of all, George Baxter, who is the Director of Development at GreenPower International. Secondly, Finley Becks-Phelps, who is the UK Development Director at Fred.Olsen Renewables. And thirdly, Michael Covington, who is an Investment Director in the Renewables team at Alpha Real Capital. And over the next 40 minutes, we'll be discussing what the key asks are from developers and investors to allow them to build and finance the projects that will be required to contribute towards our decarbonisation targets. Sorry, I can't see the gentleman on screen. Has everyone now joined us?
Yep.
Hi, George. Welcome.
Hi there.
Hi, David. It's Michael here.
Michael, you with us? And Finley, you with us?
I'm here as well.
Great stuff. Okay. So, as before, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat section and we'll try to pick up as many as we can towards the end of the session. So just to start us off, guys, could you quickly tell us about the projects your companies have developed or financed in Scotland and what you're hoping to do over the next 5 years or so if the conditions are right? George, we start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David, and hello to everybody. GreenPower International is a Scottish-based renewable energy company. We've developed over 250 megawatts of renewable energy schemes, celebrating our 21st birthday this year. And we've been involved in onshore wind primarily, but also in hydro and in solar, and developing quite a strong solar project pipeline. I personally have worked in the Highlands for many years. Formerly served, sounds like a bit of a sentence, 12 years at SSE, developing a lot of its portfolio in the Highlands. And we have a number of new sites in the Highlands, and Islands in particular, in GreenPower. I think we have a strong ambition for growth. We know that we absolutely have to deliver by 2030. I think based on the conversations that I've heard so far, I think 2030 really has to be our main focus. And I think actually that should be Scotland's big focus in terms of the COP26. What are we doing now to deliver by 2030? 2045, 2050, they don't actually really matter. In the political cycle, it's 2030 that will make the difference, and we need the actions now. And it's in that area that I think a lot of our conversations need to take place, because sure, the time for talking is up. The time for real action is now, but talk of 2045 and 2050 just allows too much wriggle room for politicians in particular to bat off tough decisions into other elected officials' political cycles and not theirs.
Okay, that's a useful introduction, and some points we'll perhaps come back to, George, and thanks for bringing your wind turbine to the table as well. Right. Finn, can I turn to you and tell us a bit about what Fred.Olsen have been doing and what you're looking to do?
Yeah, absolutely, David. And thank you very much for the invite this afternoon. I've always really enjoyed attending the SHREC conference, so to be able to talk at it is great. We've actually been at the renewables game for quite a long time now, I think 2.5 decades. We actually had the first consented project in Scotland in 1993. That came into operation in 1996. Since then, we've developed a further 5 core complexes that consist of 10 operational wind farms, totaling more than 500 megawatts of onshore wind. We've also invested more than £5.7 million in community benefits. Specifically in the northern regions, we have 3 operational sites, Poleshill and Rothes 1 and 2, totaling more than 150 megawatts. Between those developments themselves, we've almost invested further £2 million into community benefits into that area just by itself. They've now been in operation since 2005. We as an organisation are looking at making the renewables at the core of our future business, and that is evident of now having a further consented project at 25 megawatts. We've got a further 100 megawatts currently in planning, and a further 170 megawatts in early stage projects. To date, we've been very successful. We've had 100% success rate, and that is largely down to working hand in hand with the community, and it is that at the core of what we will have moving forward. And certainly we are looking very much forward to continuing our presence in the Highlands region.
Okay, that's very useful, Finn, and clearly a lot of activity up north, and we'll come back to that. And finally, Michael, can you tell us a bit about Alpha and the type of renewable projects you're interested in investing in?
Yeah, thanks, David. Hello, everyone. It's like Finley, it's a real honour to be here. I attended in person 2 years ago, and it's no exaggeration to say that the relationships that started and were developed since have led to real progress for our organisation. So it's wonderful. So Alpha Real Capital is a specialist real assets fund manager. We have just over £4 billion of our clients' money. Think of us as real assets, real long-term income, protected against inflation. Renewables has been a big success for us. We've come from a very low level to over £650 million in over 100 sites across wind, solar and hydro. We have hydros in Scotland, for example. We're capable of powering 100,000 homes with clean energy. Team of 14 people doing this full time. 3 are physically based in Edinburgh, using a panel of very talented local professional advisors, including David and his team at Harper Macleod. So, what are we thinking about? We're thinking that for the future, I should say over 20% of our investments are in Scotland by value. So we have a real passion for the market and we just want to keep going. Over half of onshore wind capacity is in Scotland, but the subsidies, RO and feed-in tariff, mainly renewables obligation, are sliding away. Not only were the earlier turbines mainly quite small and inefficient by today's monsters, efficient monsters, we're seeing that by 2030, over half of what we see around us now will have lost its subsidy. So this is tremendous opportunity for owners and developers to repower. We're investing now in our first so-called subsidy-free projects, so no subsidy at all, and nearly all of these for us are in Scotland. We're taking a very keen interest in the forthcoming onshore contracts for difference auctions. We're actively recruiting partners, and the Highlands and Islands in particular will definitely punch way above their weight, due to excellent wind conditions and local support and expertise. It was great to hear the Cabinet Secretary confirming earlier the Scottish Government's policies and desire to see tremendous development of the sector in Scotland. But, the ask is, what are investors such as Alpha looking for? So what are these asks? The key cornerstone is a strong legal framework. People always hear investors complaining about rule changes. It's fundamental to how we look after our investors, how we lower the cost of our funds. But generally speaking, long-term predictable revenues, ideally with inflation proofing, attract many more investors and deliver substantially lower costs of investment and higher valuations for everyone in the supply chain to enjoy. So this is the key trade-off, David, for the government in weighing up the cost benefit of support mechanisms.
Okay, that's very useful. I think that's a really good introduction of where you're all coming from. So Can I maybe turn first to you now, Finn? So, what are the key challenges developers face in bringing these projects to fruition, and why is overcoming them so crucial to meeting our targets?
Yeah, I can't make any secret of it. We do operate within a hugely challenging environment. We're quite fortunate having now operated for a number of decades. We've seen what works and wasn't, and what doesn't work. I think if you begin to look at projects individually, then themselves, they're fairly robust in their nature. They can take a fair degree of uncertainty. But it's when you begin to introduce new levels of risk that begins to be put into question. And when I talk about risks, I mean that historically we had the renewables obligation. We then had that changed over about the CFD. And when I look at merchant power price, how do we begin to look at the forecasting prices? There's huge variation amongst future projections. You begin to introduce the likes of cannibalization, and it gets even harder to forecast. We've got projected increases of use of system charges when it begins to look at transmission network, let alone begin to think about some of the costs that we have to incur to overcome some of the radar issues that we have. When you begin to introduce these levels of complexity, then it does make these developments particularly challenging to bring forward. So while I don't necessarily want to take away George from his discussion on MPF4, it's great that we've got an ambition from the Scottish Government to bring forward these future aspirations. But what we really need to see is a very clear commitment. What are the targets? And we need to be looking at 20 gigawatts of onshore wind. And again, to reiterate George's point, we need to be looking at what 2030 looks like and not 2045 or 50. We need to look at how that planning policy is fed down from national planning and how local authorities are supported to bring forward these ambitions. It is a challenging environment, but there are also a lot of positives to take away from it. We've got this new CFD pot coming forward later this year that will help bring a lot of certainty to developers. We also need to look at all the raft of new policies that came forward at the end of last year. It's a really encouraging place, and I think today we've had a huge amount of already very positive messages, and I think the future does look encouraging in that regard. And also, we cannot forget that the huge investment that the new renewables industry has brought forward to the Scottish economy with little or no government investment moving forward. And that in turn has also supported a significant amount of jobs. When we begin to look at individual projects, we also have direct and indirect benefits I think we need to consider. The direct benefits, I believe, are fairly evident. We're bringing forward more clean generation. We're helping meet some of the carbon reduction targets. We're introducing better connectivity in more rural areas and bringing more investment into these areas where there were none beforehand. That in turn brings more skilled jobs. But that's all great. But what are the indirect benefits that I mentioned? Well, I think we need to consider about how we as developers act in these areas. By working hand in hand with our rural communities and local areas, we can bring a whole range of different benefits that aren't directly associated to our developments, but by us being in those areas. That could mean more increase of rural heating, better transport, better broadband rollout, help support electric vehicle uptake, but ultimately helping support rural economy. That in turn helps support a green recovery that's going to be more important now than ever, particularly in the post-COVID world. I think when we try and capture all of that and why that's so important, I think the Scottish Government all in all have been very supportive of us as an industry, but we also owe it as ourselves to make sure that we are acting responsibly and demonstrating the reason, the need for that support. That in turn also helps encourage the UK government agenda in terms of putting forward robust targets, particularly as we move towards COP26. So yes, there are challenges, but it is a very exciting place that we're moving towards.
Okay, thanks, Finn. We'll maybe come back to some of those points about communities later if we've got time. George, when I started in renewables 30 years ago, the main issue for developers was planning. And 30 years on, it still seems to me that the main issue for developers is planning. So Finn has mentioned the National Planning Framework 4. Could you elaborate a bit about that and just tell us how, in your view, the planning system has to be adapted to fit in with our climate change targets?
Yeah, sure. It is really important. It's taking too long. The climate emergency was declared in 2019, and the National Planning Framework reforms aren't set to come in until 2022. So that's an issue to start with. But it's a really important process, because it's not just a national planning framework, as previous ones have been setting out a kind of spatial strategy for the country. Also, this time, for the first time after the Climate Act in 2019, contains all of Scottish planning policies, which will determine how decisions are reached. And the Minister has said that he intends to have climate change as a guiding principle for the planning system. I think it needs to become an imperative, and we need to treat the climate emergency as a real and present emergency. And so, to my previous point, that we need action, we need urgent action to what's really needed. And what's really needed actually is a planning system that can enable the deployment, and particularly in onshore wind, the most modern, efficient standard turbines where it is windy. That's what we need in a subsidy-free environment, where we need to have the most competitive and the most efficient wind farms. So that's its first task. The planning system doesn't take account of that, and that's where we need a lot more weight added to the decision making. When a decision is being made on a project, the balance is decided on sort of benefits and impacts, and we need much more weight in the planning balance onto the climate emergency. And there's a lot of people in industry calling for urgent action now. We don't need to wait until 2022 before putting more weight onto the decisions that are made to enable projects to get through and to shift that planning balance. So that's one thing that I think that we need to see happen, and we need to see happen soon. There's an election in the way, obviously at the moment, but these run-of-the-mill everyday things like elections shouldn't be getting in the way of the actions that we need to deliver on climate change. And solar as well. Solar energy wasn't even mentioned in the National Planning Framework position statement that was set out recently, and Scotland doesn't really get its fair share of solar when you look at on a UK-wide basis. And so we can do a lot more there, and so that onshore wind and solar can do a lot of the early heavy lifting in the green recovery. What would be good is to set some clear targets for volumes that we need by 2030. And if we have that confidence that, say, we're going to double the amount of onshore wind in Scotland by 2030, that means building 1,000 megawatts every year between now and then. In 2020, we only built around 30 megawatts. So there's a big job to be done there, and the planning system really holds the key to it all.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would agree with a lot of your points there, George. At SHREC, we've always focused a lot on the Highlands. Have you any specific points on the north of Scotland? I mean, how can the vast natural resources in that area be harnessed?
Well, don't get me started on wild land, but I suppose I have to mention it. Many areas in the Highlands are actually, they're declared as wild land areas, but they're barren shadows of their former selves. They're ecologically poor. They're not the living landscapes they once were, with people living in them alongside richer wildlife. And renewables can be part of creating that living landscape picture too, bringing employment and resilience to communities. And so I think we need to change the thinking here. There's often talk of the right projects in the right places. I think actually we need to discard that as a concept and start talking about as many projects in as many places as we need to hit our targets. So that rhetoric, I think, has had its day. It's become kind of meaningless. And of course, projects shouldn't be built where actual harm to endangered species or iconic settings in the Highlands that are, a lot of them are already fully protected through being national scenic areas, for example. But often landscape effects are used to attack perfectly good projects from a landscape-only perspective. Someone will always say a project is in the wrong place. And you just have to look at the trouble. Scotland, I would regard as Scotland's best located wind farm at Stronellairg, had just along the Great Glen, which was supported by local councillors and the local community, yet opposed by landscape groups. I think I would make one final comment about the responsibility of this generation. Some behave as if a wind turbine in the landscape is bad. I mean, I would disagree with that. I think they look great. But whether you love them, quite like them, don't mind them, or just plain and simple don't like them, which in most polls is around 10% of the population don't actually like them, I think they're a symbol that this generation is prepared to accept change in the landscape over a relatively short period, whether it's 25, 30 or 50 years, to tackle the climate threat, which will have impacts for many, many generations to come. So I think we need to start thinking long-term and acting fast, and that's the dynamic that the planning system in particular needs to enable for the Highlands.
Okay, thanks. Michael, turn to you. So what sort of improvements are investors looking for to ensure the necessary money comes into Scotland to enable these projects to be built?
Yeah, thanks, David. The money is clearly lined up. There are new funds being launched on a weekly basis. So, socially responsible investing really is becoming a reality. Just before I plunge in, though, George's point about, my spin on it is a wind turbine is there for 40 years. We're not blasting the Grampian Mountains to mine or do landfill sites. There's a turbine there for 40 years to prevent runaway global warming. We'll talk later, I think, as time permits, about how communities could buy into that, and not just as a moral, as a responsibility to future generations, but also what's good for the finances and economic health of communities. For me, though, without doubt, the key thing is grid in the Highlands and Islands. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the north of Scotland is powered by wind and water, and what a blessing that is. But as SSE Networks has said recently, about 2/3 of that power is exported southwards, to the Central Belt and also into the north of England, and it's a truly national grid, of course. National grid, it was conceived in the 50s and 60s for the whole nation. It's been a tremendous asset and really looked after us, as has the offshore oil and gas resources. And, they were built ahead of need. You don't go, everyone needs electricity, but there's no network. Somebody has to put in place that critical infrastructure. I was joking with you, David, that I'm sure once upon a time the A9 road was relatively empty, but you felt maybe it was never that empty. But just like the Kevin Costner movie Field of Dreams, I think with the grid, not just transmission, but distribution, if you build it, they will come. Just a statistic, 7.4 gigawatts of onshore wind approximately in Scotland. Finn was saying 20 gigawatts by 2030 onshore. Put that into context, the Bewley-Denny transmission line, an amazing but controversial project, 220 kilometres through the Cairngorms, not least, 400 kilovolts. That is 1.2 gigawatts of capacity. That is 800, Glasgow as a city is 800 megawatts at peak, but 1.2 gigawatts compared to at least 10 gigawatts in the next 9 years. We've really got to think about building the field of dreams. And just to touch on the Viking Energy wind farm, people, I think, regulators, I think in the government, in the Scottish Crown Estate, everybody is trying to do their bit to help the Shetlands deliver this monumental 550 megawatt project. The new turbine heights that were agreed, and George touched on modern efficient machinery. These things are 155 meters from base to tip, let alone the mountains they're on, the plains. They're 18 meters taller than the Old Man of Hoy. So the Orkneys won't be very happy about the competition. So, exciting things, but there's just so much to do on the national transmission grids. And just a final point from me, David, on grids, talking to wind farm developers, they're overjoyed if they have connection offers to put new capacity on within a couple of years. Some people have been notified it's going to be 2030. And then you have all these curtailments and the dreaded active network management to contend with. And I'll say, as an investor, somebody says, here's my new wind farm, Alpha. We go, this is great. How can we help? And then they say, well, actually, the grid's really challenging. We can't guarantee it will be allowed to export all the time. We can't even say that the next door neighbouring wind farm might trip out the whole circuit. And whatever the quality of our development approach, we could be yanked offline. So lots of issues there.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Michael. And I'm just watching, there's quite a few questions coming into the chat based on your comments so far, all of you, so we'll try and get to those. But Finn mentioned earlier the next CFD allocation round. I mean, do any of these grid issues which you've mentioned impact on that, Michael?
Yeah, there's lots of very clever economists that work for the ministries, and they're working for developers such as Fred.Olsen, I'm sure. We subscribe to some very high quality services to help guide the way, particularly in subsidy free, and the CFD, David. don't pin me on this, but levelized cost of energy, which is effectively what the price of the power has to be to give the turbine manufacturers the capex, to give the installers the running around money, the labor money, and to pay everyone and to give investors a target rate of return. That's £40 per megawatt hour with very efficient new machines. It's heading south. So that's great. That's cheaper than we're used to seeing for pool price power. However, who pays for the transmission network? It really is one of the most fun things I had to learn was jargon. And to NUOS, transmission network use of system, it's clearly upset SSE networks, because only a couple of days ago, they put out a very interesting, well-researched report saying, did you know that a wind farm in the north of Scotland pays on top of every other cost, £5.50 per megawatt hour of energy. But, and I don't want to start any conflicts here, an equivalent wind farm in Wales that they identified actually gets remunerated, gets paid to be a distributed generator helping out. They get paid £2.80. So the delta between the two, doing a bit of mental maths, £8.30, that's 20% difference. Talk about running to stand still. Where's that level playing field? And to finish, this theme of hidden costs, maybe, the CFD consultation it's still suggesting that if the day ahead power price in that zone is negative for any short period, 15 minutes or half hour, then the whole day is off. All bets are off, no subsidy for that day. And you might think, oh, that's okay. What we do is a drop in the ocean. but it's not. It's a local consideration, power prices. The UK, Scotland is zonal. And you simply can't deliver tens of gigawatts of offshore and another 10 gigawatts of onshore capacity with the wind resource pretty uniform across the British Isles, pretty uniform. Everyone's going to be scrambling to get customers for their power at the same time. And as strange as it seems, that leads to negative power prices. So if you have a mechanism where only for 15 minutes of a day, there's a negative power price, you lose your subsidy, I don't know what investors are going to make of it, because the more you build, the worse that's going to get.
Okay, that's very useful. There's a couple of other topics I'd like to touch on before we finish. One is in relation to supply chain, and the other is in relation to involvement of communities. Finn, one of the issues the Scottish Government has been pushing is more local content in developments, especially in the supply chain, because obviously they need to be able to demonstrate to the people of Scotland that more Scottish jobs have been created in exchange for the planning consents which they'll issue. What are your views on that and how achievable it is?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I've got fairly sort of strong views on that, and I think I've highlighted a couple of times today already the need to work very closely with your local areas. And when I talk about local areas, I don't just necessarily mean communities. I will talk about supply chain. Going back to George's point about the 2030 targets, we have proposing huge, big ambitions, and of course concentrate initially on onshore wind. We as developers, or maybe a smaller group of individuals, but to bring some of these developments forward needs a huge amount of expertise. They're the people that are really driving these projects. You begin to think about construction and what is needed for that, not just in terms of expertise, but even to begin to think about materials and machinery and cranes to build these things. If you begin to think about operation, we as an organisation have over 250 operational units. It takes over a day to maintain just one of those, and they have to be maintained every single year. Multiply that across the entire country, we're desperately short of real skilled expertise. So it's not really a matter of whether we should be, thinking about our supply chain. We have to think about our supply chain to start bringing forward these expertises to help meet the future ambitions. Introduce offshore into that argument. We're going to have a huge port issue. How do we begin to retrofit some of these ports to help the fabrication of offshore turbines? How do we use these ports to begin to facilitate the operation of that development? There is a real shortage of expertise to bring forward the future ambitions. And so we are at a prime opportunity now, particularly in the next 5-10 years, to all work together, to work within our local areas, to make sure that we are bringing forward the expertise across a broad spectrum of supply chain. So, from my perspective, I'm very supportive of it.
Yeah, and that ties into what we were talking about in the earlier session, the just transition and how oil and gas workers could help. I mean, George, do you have similar views as developers?
Yeah, I think, to my mind, if we had imagined 20 years ago that we would have 8 gigawatts of onshore wind in Scotland, which I think someone saying that around the turn of the century would have been, laughed at. We have it. If we had known then that we would have 8 gigawatts, we would have a much bigger supply chain now. So the opportunity we have now is to have a much more, a stronger approach to a more confident pipeline so that the supply chain can invest. And again, I hate to say it, it goes back to the planning system and policy to give this not just developers, but the supply chain confidence to invest in the short term for long-term gain. And you have to bear in mind that various studies that have been conducted over on onshore projects show that the actual level of domestic spend for an onshore wind farm over its lifetime is still pretty good. It's at above 60%, 65% of the overall money spent on a wind farm is retained domestically within the UK. So that's very positive. I think there's a bit of focus on where the turbines come from, but when you look at the whole the whole picture. It's not as bad as is painted. But Finn's right. We need to invest in people, and we need to invest in the supply chain so that Scotland and the UK can reap the rewards of the transformation.
Okay, thanks for that.
Gentlemen, I hate to butt in. David, I don't know if you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me. What an immensely fascinating discussion. Goodness, you would not believe how the question boards have been lighting up with your questions. I'm conscious that we promised everyone lunch at 1:30, so I hope I'm not jumping in too soon. I wonder if we can cover off some of these questions. Am I okay just to go ahead on these?
Yeah, when you go, Nikki.
Okay, first couple, I'm going to put these two together. They're both about onshore and offshore wind. Rob Gibson is asking, is there a trend of developers to move action to more profitable offshore wind and leave consented onshore sites fallow? And Gavin Kingsmith is asking, do the developers accept that Scotland's onshore wind farms, built and envisaged, will have negligible effect globally on the climate, but will have a long-term damaging effect on the Scottish land? George, I think this is one for you. And that Scotland should be in the forefront of offering refuge for those in other parts of the world affected by past energy exploitation by humans. I don't know who wants to dive in with that one first.
I'll deal with the question that I tend to think of as the China syndrome, where folks say, "Oh, it doesn't matter what we do here; it doesn't really make any difference." We need to take responsibility for what we can do. We are actually a relatively small part of the global population, so but that's no excuse for not doing anything. We need to bear the responsibility that we have. There's also a responsibility to harness the amazing renewable resource that we have in this country, which is the envy of many other countries, and assist others in our region to decarbonise as well through the export of power and technology. So I think that the question about, there's no point in us doing anything, it doesn't make any difference, essentially is what's been said. Frankly, I think that's a bit misconstrued and misleading.
Yeah, I would say, goodness me, jobs are created by cheap energy, jobs and prosperity, cheap, clean energy. And there is a once in a generation opportunity to take this so far beyond. It will have tremendous benefits everywhere. So I think saying, what about the landscape? Yes, okay, these are beautiful landscapes. Scotland enjoys vast vistas, but these machines are needed now, and it's not landfill. We're not blasting mountains. The other one I'd just comment on quickly, offshore wind is a very specialized investment topic, very, very large, monumentally large schemes. And most investors by value can't play. They won't play. It's too much. But investors are lining up to fund high quality, highly efficient onshore projects. And there's going to be oodles of capital for well-developed, well-planned schemes. So it's, put the grid in, get the communities on side. It's there to be done.
Okay. Another question then, and this one is directly to Finley. Over to you then, Finn, from Tor Justad. Does Finley envisage developers getting directly involved in local projects, such as improved broadband or public transport? Or are you, thinking of community funds which developers currently contribute to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a bit of a combination of both, if I'm being honest. I think we as developers can facilitate a lot through our individual developments. Certainly we could begin to support potential opportunities that even exist on the site alone. That might even be introduction of, say, for example, mountain bike trails, or helping better access to more rural areas. You can actually use the infrastructure on site to help the rollout of broadband. On top of that, you can also look at introducing apprenticeship schemes and have contracts within the actual consent that will help facilitate the rollout of those opportunities. And there's some really encouraging signs of communities around Scotland working together to take some of the volume of community benefit that's coming forward and really beginning to protect and secure these rural communities that are using the community benefit at the core of that aspiration. So, yeah, I mean, it really is both strands, and we as a developer certainly look to try and do as much as possible as part of these planning applications.
Okay, lovely, fairly comprehensive answer there, and I hope it answers Tor's question. And just a final one, because I've got one eye on the clock. This is from Lloyd Edwards, and I appreciate that this is a big question as well, but I'll ask for a really brief answer from each of you, starting with you, Mike. In the context of hundreds of billions that are earmarked for mega projects such as HS2, motorways expansions, and nuclear, especially when compared to falling costs of sustainable energy, where would the panel prefer to see this money spent? And bearing in mind, I'm giving you, literally 15 seconds each. Over to you, Mike, first.
Nikki, monumentally large pumped storage to allow us to have strategic storage of the electricity from offshore and onshore highlands and islands.
So pump storage from Mike. George?
Well, I think we need to be putting money into all sorts of things across decarbonising the economy through renewables, and anything which takes away demand from renewables, particularly if it's either unproven or inherently unsustainable, should be avoided. Okay,
and Finn?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo George's comment. We as an industry don't necessarily need the support. We've had 20 years of that, but it's not just renewable energy, it is across the entire sector in terms of decarbonisation, heating, transport, and even on pump storage. So it's a combined effort to really support everything to meet the decarbonisation targets.
And David, I didn't warn you about this, but I'm going to give you a chance to come in with your 10 seconds worth on that one as well. Where would you spend the money?
Probably used up the 10 seconds already thinking about it, but no, I wouldn't spend it on HS2 type projects. But I think, and I was listening to Bill Gates' webcam the other night, and he was making the point that we either have to deal with the storage issue or we need more nuclear. I appreciate he wasn't talking solely about Scotland. So I think, as Michael said, I think we have to solve the storage issue, and that moves into carbon capture and storage as well. But there's lots of places, as long as it's spent correctly.
As long as it's spent correctly. There we go. That's the catch-all answer.
Just put me in charge, Nicky, and we'll be okay.
Why didn't we all think of that? That is it. We are eating into people's sandwich time, or they're going outside for a quick walk with the dog time, or their networking time. So I will thank you all, gentlemen, for an incredibly interesting discussion. And I see that the questions are still coming in. So we will try and capture as many of those as we possibly can. And we will store them in a document with the answers if we possibly can, and we'll get that out. Thank you to you all very, very much. We are going to take a quick break for lunch now, half an hour for you to use as you wish. So either get outside, get away from the screen. It's a lovely day here in Inverness. I hope it's nice where you are as well. And come back here at 2 p.m. sharp. We'll be talking about decarbonisation and the use of Scotland's natural resources with Nature Scot and Forestry Land Scotland. If you are taking a break from the screen, just walk away from your laptop, leaving the webinar open, and we will still be here when you get back, I promise. The other option, for those of you who are craving adult conversation with people who are not in your immediate family or delivering groceries to your house, come and join us in the meeting rooms. It's still a Zoom platform, but you will have to leave the webinar and then come out and log in to a meeting room, and you will have been sent all the details of how to do that. The networking in meeting rooms have been randomly set up, so you don't know who you're going to be in with next. Any conversation, any chat that comes up while you're having your sandwiches that you think it would be useful for us all to know, then do put that into the Q&A boxes just as an observation, and we will pick up as many as we can. So thank you so much for joining us so far this afternoon. Enjoy your lunch, enjoy your networking, enjoy your walk with the dog, and we will see you.